So we're going to do something a little bit odd, which is we're going to apply some Barry Harris ideas to some fusion. Barry himself was definitely not a fan of fusion music. Having been friends with Joe Zawinul in New York in the 1950s, he ended up saying that, in his opinion, Joe Zawinul was no longer a jazz musician when he was playing with Weather Report. That is not a view I share. And I would also say that the thing is that bebop is a really important constituent element of fusion music. Fusion music, of course, being, well, the fusion between different styles. So Joe Zawinul, of course, was a bit of a Bud Powell head back in the 1950s, which is what he used to, study or at least kind of co-study with Barry. And this obviously informed the aesthetic of his playing, even though, of course, fusion is not bebop. It has a big helping of it. And a lot of my favourite fusion players, such as people like Mike Brecker and Mike Stern, as well as some of the younger players like Charles Altura, and even some of the more rock-oriented players like Guthrie Govan and people like that, use a lot of bebop phraseology in their playing. So it kind of feels like it's not going anywhere soon. And I don't think there's any better toolkit for learning bop than Barry Harris. So today we're going to dive into what the Barry toolkit can offer fusion players. And we're going to be starting with an F7 vamp. And we're going to be using a very simple scale, which Barry Harris calls the dominant scale. And it's probably better known to most modern guitar players as the F Mixolydian. So it's this scale. Now you'll notice, rather than playing it at one great big, I'm playing it actually in lots of little one-octave positions, which is something I learned from Barry. And for scale construction, it actually makes for line construction, it actually makes a lot of sense to do this. Okay, so I wanted to talk about line construction basics. And there's a few, I can only really scratch the surface in this video, but there's quite a few tools that you can use just out of things like the Barry Harris DVD book or Ronnie Ben-Hur's Talk Jazz book. But I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about some of the basic line construction materials that I'd use. So some of them might be familiar, playing thirds, for instance. And then we can also play triads and chords through the scale as well.
Christian has yet again forgotten to mention his album, which he should be shilling for coin. If you are interested in checking it out, just follow the link that shall mysteriously appear above my head.
We've obviously got 7 different triads and 7 different 4-note chords that we can play through that scale. And of course, I've just demonstrated them in one position, but you might want to learn them in a whole bunch of positions. Also along the neck and so on and so forth, because that will make them more useful for improvising. Now, of those 7 chords or 7 arpeggios, there's 2 really important ones that I tend to use a lot and certainly come up a lot in bebop lines. And the first one is what's known as the important minor. So in the key of F7, that would be like a C minor seventh, or a C minor triad like this. Okay, and now that creates a sort of quite an interesting sort of sound on the F7. It kind of makes a little bit sort of like suspended almost. And we can lean further into that kind of suspended sound. This is a sound that Wes Montgomery likes a lot, which is use the flat 7 major. And then we're getting like the 11th, 13th and 9th over the F7. And this, again, sort of gives us kind of more of a suspended dominant sound. I know that in a lot of theory books it says like the 4th is an avoid note over dominant. I don't buy this. I think the 4th or the 11th sounds great over dominant. And you can hear like all the great guitar players playing it, whether they are fusion players or bebop players or whatever they are. Okay. So the last thing we can do with arpeggios that I think is really, really good is we can pivot them. So, for instance, rather than just playing, for instance, the major 7th and E flat major 7th, arpeggio straight up like that, we can take the first note and then, which would be this one, then put it up an octave, and then play the rest of the arpeggio. We'll do that for the minor as well. And that gives you a more interesting. You can do this with all of the arpeggios through the or the chords, as Barry would put it, through the. So we can use any of those if we want, and then we can put those together with the rest of our arpeggios, and they can create a more interesting melodic contour. So we're not always just going up and down arpeggios and scales, but we're actually jumping around a bit. One of the most important things that Barry Harris brings to the table is the use of chromaticism, and these also get called sometimes bebop scales, but Barry's way of teaching it is a little bit more involved. So there's an excellent video from Rotem Sivan that I'll link to if you want to find out a little bit more, but we're just going to use the 2 basic Barry Harris rules, which is that we're going to descend the scale, the F7 scale, and what we're going to do is if we start on an odd numbered note, so 1, 3, 5, 7, we're going to add 1 note, and that note will be between the root and the flat 7th. So that's kind of the familiar dominant bebop scale that you might know from other sources. And then if we're starting on the even number note, so 2, 4, 6, one of the notes that isn't a chord tone of F7, then we're actually just not going to add any note in at all. And the effect of this is that we always end up with our chord tones on the beat eventually. I mean, maybe after a couple of beats. We generally play this exercise descending always to the root. So now the next version of the rules is that we can add 3 or 1. So we add one of them we add in the same place as before, which is between the root and the flat 7th, and we can add the other ones between the 2nd and the root. And this is if we're starting on an even numbered note, so 2, 4, 6, and if we're starting from an odd number note, we can add another note in again between the 3 and the 2nd. So we end up with this chromatic run going from the 3rd down to the flat 7. Probably enough information for now. We're going to have a go at sort of playing around with that. This really just scratches the surface. There's really a lot more, but I find that just playing around with these and mixing them up in interesting ways can get you into some interesting lines very quickly. Okay, so the F7 thing is cool, but what I wanted to show is that we don't need to learn a bunch of modes right away. We can actually learn just this scale and then applications of it. This is something that Mick Goodrick would call derivative thinking, by the way, as opposed to parallel thinking. But we can use the same half steps and that we add in all the rest of it as we would if we were playing over a F7 chord, and it will sound just as well. If we use our two chords from earlier, the E flat major 7th and the C minor 7th. So if we're playing over an E flat major 7th, we can continue to use the F7. So for a major chord, a Lydian chord, in fact, we use the dominant a step up. And if we're using a minor 7th chord, for instance, we use the 2-5 relationship and we go for a C minor over the F7. And I'll notice that these are the same chords that we're using to create sounds over the E flat 7. So you can think of those as being a family together, that they all kind of work together, those three sounds. Okay? So I'm just going to demonstrate that over the other two chord types. Okay, so as a little note, the one on the C minor 7, if you just take the first example of the added note rule, you play the F7, the added note between the root and the flat 7th. The rules can get much more complicated than this, by the way. This is just a simple version of it. Then you can actually play over C minor 7. Then a lot of people would call that the, especially if you go down to the C minor, they would call that the something called the bebop minor, the bebop Dorian, sometimes called the bebop minor scale. This is just the same scale in a different context. It's a mode of the added note rules. The difference is that we can also do more complicated versions of the same thing by, by adding in the more complicated add note rules, and then also using the ones for the even numbered notes and so on. So actually we get a little bit more mileage out of the Barry Harris approach. I don't think there's a good name for the one that has that's on Lydian, by the way. I haven't seen that one. Maybe if somebody has, they can put it in the notes below. There are many fusion standards such as Spain, Red Clay or Got a Match, which are basically 2-5-1 conventional harmony. So you can play them like bebop tunes, even though they are they have a very different feel. That's cool, but I'm not going to really talk about that today because I feel like that's been well covered by other YouTubers as well. So you can use the bebop tool set to do that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'd definitely advise checking out, perhaps I've got some videos on my own channel which could talk about minor 2-5-1s, for instance. I feel like it's both beyond the scope and also a little bit less interesting to talk about that, but I may make a video on Spain and tunes like that if you really want me to talk about them. What I thought might be more interesting is to take a look at something quite non-functional. So I'm going to have a look at the Jaco Pastorius Weather Report tune, Havona, which comes from their breakthrough album Heavy Weather. And this is quite an unusual chord progression. So Havona is largely, the blowing happens on major 7th chords or major 7 sharp 11th chords. I'm going to choose to treat these all as Lydian chords, which means that for every single chord I'm going to be putting a dominant scale a step up. So the E major 7th, for instance, I'm going to be playing an F sharp dominant. Over C major 7th, I'm going to be playing a D7. Over B major 7th, a C sharp 7 or D flat 7, depending on how I look at it, and so on and so forth. Over the E minor 9, I'm going to be using the 2-5 relationship and playing A7, which is, by the way, the same scale as the previous bar for G major 7th. And then for that little vampy bit where I go the A sus or it's this really, isn't it? That bit I'm going to be playing over the A7. Well, so thanks for watching. I hope you find that useful and interesting. If you have any comments, please post below, and of course don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.